Greetings, good evening. I trust you've had a fruitful day. I do not say happy, although I wish it had been happy for you. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the Buddha, the Blessed Noble and Self-Awakened One. This evening, I just want to start with a practical question that's come through. It's from Danny. I have a technical job assembling electromechanical units. This involves reading a drawing, collating the parts, and getting the parts to fit together. Now, I try to maintain a degree of mindfulness, but with all the movements associated with these activities, it becomes exhausting. Instead, I note walking from A to B and standing, but I spend more time at the bench. I have tried to note looking and seeing during these times, and even with this, I'm aware of other actions too, and then note that I'm ignoring these objects to force my attention on the seeing. This can be followed by frustration, again noted. My formal practice is one of slow noting, even though, for example, when I raise my heel, I'm aware of the other touch sensations, but do not note them as independent sensations. My question then is, how to maintain mindfulness at work when I'm involved in an activity that needs to be done with relative speed? Now, this is, by the way, a regular sort of question that comes from people who practice the Mahasi technique. The Mahasi technique is a very specific technique for a particular type of situation, the retreat. And the whole idea, of course, is to slow everything down. And the noting is a way of stopping the mind from wandering. It has this other purpose, which is to turn everything into an object. You're pointing at something all the time. But in terms of this question, it's the retreat or the Mahasi technique is about slowing everything down and noting, especially intentions, and becoming more and more refined in order to see how the mind is creating the world that we're experiencing. Now, when you go out into daily life, I didn't have trouble, this sort of trouble, because I had started with Zen, and I practiced up at Throstle Hole in Northumberland, and I think it's Northumberland, yeah. Turn left at Newcastle, and there we did things at speed. I mean, really fast, and for long times, an hour, 2 hours, even sometimes. And I remember one time, for instance, I was given the job of the dining room, and part of it was polishing the chairs, and I had to polish the chairs as if they'd never been polished, and you did it at great speed. And the understanding is, of course, is that the faster you go, the more you've got to keep your mindfulness. Your attention is right there. If your attention wanders, then you'll drop something, you'll trip up, you'll make a mistake. It's not as though mindfulness stops you making mistakes as such, because accidents happen, yeah. So I never had this problem of transferring noting into daily life, because frankly, I never did it. It didn't see, because of my Zen training, I knew that what I had to do was just, put my attention on what I was doing. Now, when you are doing something, especially something that, demands attention, I mean, careful attention, such as the work that Danny does, then, of course, noting can get in the way because your whole attention is towards the object. Now, those of you who've been here know that when I talk about meditation at work, doing the chores in the morning, then yes, the idea is to be with what you're doing, And sometimes there's a sort of a confusion about self-awareness, that you have to be aware of yourself all the time doing something. But that's, of course, a split consciousness, in the sense that 1 minute you're aware of yourself and 1 minute you're aware of what you're doing. So that's not where we want to end up. Self-awareness arises quite naturally, and you can't get rid of it by creating another self. That just creates confusion. But as you keep paying attention to what you're doing, then there's moments of absorption. Now, this happens to us quite easily when we're watching something exciting like a film. You absorb into the film. You disappear for a couple of hours. And then when you come out, you say, oh, that's a good film, is it? And it's the same with hobbies. When we're really interested in what we're doing, gardening or something, time can just fly by. And that's when we lose that sense of self, somebody doing something. And with it, of course, a sense of time. It always happens to the computer a lot, and other ways like Facebook and all that. So when we're at work, our effort, of course, is to be attentive to what we're doing. Now, it might be that some noting helps us just to pay attention to that, but in a sense, we don't want it to get in the way. We want to pay attention to such a point that I'm just being my doing. That's the trick of it, you see. So it's not a case of being self-aware of what you're doing. It's not a case of being aware of everything else around what you're doing. It's a case of one pointed concentration work that you're supposed to be attending to. So it's not a case of noting everything specifically, and at times you can just drop that. When you know that your attention is steady, when you can trust it to remain with what you're doing, then you've arrived. That's it. Now, when you go into an absorption where you lose that sense of self and you're just doing, of course, how you enter into it is the state of the mental state that you'll be developing. So if you go into it with a calmness, a sense of, just doing, a sense of equanimity or whatever, or even a sense of kindness. I mean, that's more easy with if you're tending to people rather than a machine and stuff, or with a machine, it'd be more carefulness, to be caring. So it makes everything easy if you can bring your heart into it. give it a good reason for doing what you're doing. And if you go into it with care and attention, affectionate awareness, excuse me, then you come out with more of that, because you're developing it. If you go in there with a sense of rush, then of course you're reinforcing that attitude, and you come out with more rush, and that can lead to an early exhaustion. So I'm presuming that what Danny's saying here is that trying to note and do the work he's found exhausting, and rightly so. So what the thing to do is to do the work. If the mind's very jittery, it's going all over the place, then yes, keep noting a little bit just to put your attention there. But as soon as you feel that you're holding your attention and that you're involved, then let go of it. Right? Just be aware. It's enough. So now, if that didn't answer the question, especially Danny, if it didn't answer the question, just send me another email. And do feel free to send questions about your meditation practice and so on. Very good. So I'm finally arriving at the question: are all the stages of the Eightfold Path equally important? Now, the short answer is yes, but some precede the others. So they have preference in sense of preceding the others. But eventually, they're all important in our practice. And so the first thing is to be clear as to what the Eightfold Path is actually referring to here. So remember, we've got right view, right understanding, which is followed by right attitude, right intention, and then you have right speech, you have right action, right livelihood. That's interesting, huh? And then you have right concentration, right awareness, and right effort, right awareness, right concentration. Now, interestingly enough, when you actually talk about this as a practice, you start off with sila, you start off with morality, which is right speech, right action, right livelihood. And then you talk about the meditation. And then finally, you talk about the wisdom, the right view and right attitude. But when you're actually talking about it as a logical process as to how it actually, knits all together, then you talk about it in this eightfold way. So I'm going to follow just the eightfold path, not the teaching way of sila, samadhi, panya, which is morality, concentration or attentiveness, and wisdom. Yeah. So when the Buddha talks about samadhi, right view, right awareness, he's basically referring to the Four Noble Truths as the base of our understanding. And from a practical point of view, from our practice point of view, in terms of vipassana, it really is relating to those three characteristics of existence, that the cause of suffering is desire, that everything changes, nothing actually changes into something else, everything is quite spare, quite distinct, and there's this constant impermanence going on, and that everything is not self. From a human point of view, everything is not self. Everything isn't substantial. Nothing can exist on its own. It's always in relationship, in dependency on something. So obviously the body's dependent on the air that we breathe and so on. And the heart dependent on relationships, and the mind dependent on information. So everything has something to feed. It's got to be fed. It's got to be related to. But the interesting thing is, this samadhi, this right view, is really about conceptual thinking. And if you think about it, everything that we experience during the day, everything we look at, we hear, etc., etc., it's always fitting it into a particular concept. This process actually has a word in psychology, apperception. So you see something, and you've not seen it before, and when you look at it closely and get closer, oh yeah, well that must be a type of fly, yeah. Where you taste something which you haven't tasted before, is, oh well, this must be a type of Chinese dish. So you're always fitting it into your preconceived concepts, your preconceived ideas, which have been built up ever since we were born, and a lot of them are sort of subconscious. We're not fully aware of these concepts that we are always looking at the world through. The obvious ones, things like freedom. Now, what do we mean by freedom? See, and this idea, I remember a few years ago now, there was this whole thing about the right to insult, which is a very sort of aggressive way of saying that, you can say things which might upset others, but the way it came across was that you had to go and punch somebody with your new ideas or with your view. So this whole idea of free speech, the whole idea of personal liberty, the whole idea of democracy, parliamentary democracy, all these are great big concepts which manifest our relationship to the world we find ourselves in. And there's the negative ones, there's all the prejudices, sexism, racism, ageism. Now, I'm very much aware of ageism these days. So you can see the way we look at the world is always coming from some preconceived ideas. And what the Buddha says is that unless we can really correct these ideas, unless we can correct these perceptions, these conceptions, then we're just not going to get out of the mess we're in. And that's why he's always keen to deconstruct what we experience and to begin to investigate what we experience. So the main one is, of course, the one that we, should we say, directly experience virtually all the time, is this relationship we have to pleasure and pain, pleasant and unpleasant. And what he's saying is, if you remember from the beginning of the discourse last night, it's neither indulging nor is it being averse to something. So we're trying to lift ourselves out of this reactivity, right, which comes from a fundamental misunderstanding somewhere as to where we can find happiness. Yeah, that's where the base of it is. We all want to be happy, and we're all chasing happiness. We've all got our own definition of happiness, and it's all coming from this wrong understanding as to where we can find true happiness, yeah, or true well-being, or true ease with living, an accommodation with life which no longer is painful for us. So samadhi is that. And included in that would be the very important teaching about karma, the fact that when we act, there are consequences. That's a real experience, a real understanding. I mean, there were teachers at the time of the Buddha who said that there was one especially, Belatiputta, I think his name was, who said it didn't matter if you went down one side of the Ganges, full of compassionate act and generosity, and up the other side, full of murder and thieving, wouldn't make a difference at all. It had no consequence. So there was all these peculiar ideas going around at the time, and the Buddha was clear about action and consequence of action, and that the action had to have some awareness of what you were doing. So killing something by accident, or the usual thing of, say, sometimes here, I've not done it so much here, but at Gaia House, I remember when I was there, I'd be walking in the dark and I could hear this crunch, and it'd be a snail I just stood on, and that obviously I didn't mean to do it. I've got a natural regard for snails. But and that wouldn't be considered to have bad karma, except that, of course, one feels guilty anyway. One feels bad anyway. But that's not necessary, because there wasn't the intention there. So the whole teaching about karma, it comes into this right understanding. Now, when we've got this right understanding, as I say, that comes first, and it begins with what we hear, what we're told, what we receive. And then, as it were, it becomes our own personal knowledge, our own personal understanding when we think about it. Often, I'm sure you've found that you've understood something, but when you've tried to explain it to somebody else, you can't do it. And so that's the same with this growth of understanding. The first is to, through your reading, through your listening, etc., information comes in, and then somehow you've got to sort of think about it. You've got to activate it within yourself, and then it becomes your own property. And then, of course, it has to be reinforced by direct experience, and that's vipassana jnana, knowing by way of direct experience. And that's when it becomes your own personal experience. And then you find it has this flowing through the rest of the path. And the next thing, of course, is that it changes your attitudes. It changes what you intend. Some people translate it as thought, which I can understand, but I don't think it's quite right. I don't think it quite get across the meaning of Samasankappa, excuse me, because when that's described, it's described as moving away from greed and selfishness towards generosity, and it's a process of renunciation, renouncing that wrong desire. So moving from greed towards generosity. It's described as moving towards hatred and aversion towards love and acceptance. And it's described as moving away from harmfulness, from cruelty, from one-upmanship and all that sort of stuff towards compassion. So these are attitudes. And it's out of these attitudes that these intentions begin to manifest in a given circumstance. And from then, of course, you're into right thinking in your mind, which is a sort of speech. I mean, you're talking to yourself. Then it goes into right speech, right action, right livelihood. And all this is supported by your meditation. Okay, and we'll say a bit more about the right speech, right action, and all that, and especially right livelihood, actually, tomorrow evening. So that's the that's the short answer is that all these sections in the Eightfold Path are equally important, but that some precede another, right? And of course, right understanding precedes them all. It then has the effect upon your attitudes, and then the rest flows naturally depending on the circumstance. So sometimes you're talking, sometimes you're doing something, sometimes you're at work. Okay. So if any questions arise about that, do send me an email. So I shall leave it there for this evening so that we can get back